the webinar today, for spending a few minutes talking about what I think is a very important issue. And it's kind of the crux of my book that Jared mentioned that's just been published. And that's niche practices and getting more narrow in a strategic way to grow your practice. And obviously we'll be talking about that today in detail. So I guess though, if I could get across one point in the next 45 minutes, it would be that I think it's critically important that lawyers act in a more entrepreneurial fashion. And, what I mean by that is, entrepreneurs, one thing successful ones do very well is they think long-term and they think very strategically. They keep their eye on the big picture. And I think, the problem or impediment that I see, and certainly it impacted me when I practiced law, is that most lawyers, understandably, get caught up in the day-to-day craziness of the practice of law. And so it's difficult to think strategically about the big picture in that environment. Instead of thinking about the big picture, we think about, and I say we because again, I did this and I still do it in running my business now. It's difficult to get out of this trap, but we think about the little picture and we focus on the day-to-day, whatever happens to be in front of us at the moment. If work is slow, what happens? That's when we ramp up business development activity. And then next thing you know, work comes in the door and we start to focus on the work and we tamp down activity on the business development front. And so it's really a roller coaster that I think many of us find ourselves on, and it's a difficult one to get off. It's a much more of a reactive way of working. And the ironic thing about this is that, our lack of strategy often leads us to spend more time thinking about things like strategy and tactics. It's because we sense something is wrong, we sense something is off, and we should be doing something differently, but we're not quite sure what to do about it. And so as a result, we end up consuming a tremendous amount of professional improvement advice in search of answers to this problem we're facing and that we're grappling with, but we never get around to implementing it very effectively. And part of this, I think, is because it's difficult to think long term. I've heard various people talk about this, and I think it's pretty apt and pretty accurate. It stems from many of us overestimating what we can get done in a single day, right? So I don't know about you, but oftentimes I'll prepare a to-do list and I'll have 20 items on it, and which is crazy. It's impossible to think that you can accomplish that much in a single day. But we overestimate our ability to do so. But then we underestimate what we can get done in a year, for example. The enormity of the task seems too big, and we think, well, there's no way I can transform my practice or do something, otherwise transformational in just a year. So we underestimate our ability to do so, and so we do stay in that short-term thinking, loop. And while we can have a productive day thinking short-term in that fashion, with longer-term thinking, we really can transform our life and our practice and our career. So again, if I have a directive, it's to urge you to do something and stick with it for, say, a 12-month period. Take action, take some risks in developing and building your practice. Behave differently in some fashion from what you're doing today when it comes to building that practice. And so while there's many things you can do to build a practice, I'm going to talk about one that I think works particularly well based on my study of behavior of lawyers and what works and what doesn't, and speaking to people, particularly in conjunction with writing my book. And I think it works well, but it may not work for everyone. and that's okay. And I guess what I'd like to get across though is just do something long term and stick with it, and that'll inevitably lead you to do something else, and that will help you to grow your practice. So with that kind of setup, let's get started in more detail. So again, the basic proposition that I'm putting forth is that, you know, in this competitive legal marketplace that you're all competing in, you need to offer the marketplace something different. And I think that something different is a narrow, specialized expertise, something that a client can sink their teeth into, and that there's a real market for. And it's not that being a well-rounded lawyer is a bad thing. Certainly a lawyer with a depth and a breadth to their practice and knowledge is a valuable asset to a client. The problem is, though, that simply positioning yourself that way, as someone who provides, for example, full service, or someone who possesses general knowledge, is often ineffective from a marketing and positioning standpoint. You simply can't be all things to all people. That's because, you know, if you observe consumer behavior across all aspects of today's economy, consumers are trending towards specialization. And that's true in, like I said, in almost every industry and field. Let's take the medical field, for example. When you have a cold or the flu, you go and you see your general practitioner, right? You get in a car, you drive over, you might get a prescription or otherwise get a diagnosis as to, you know, what's the problem. But then you drive home and you deal with the issue. But on the other hand, when you have say a heart blockage or aggressive cancer, you get on a plane and you go seek out the diagnosis and prescribed treatment from the top specialist that you can find. The specialist in this case doesn't seek you out. You get on a plane and go seek them out. So that's really the difference, I think, in a nutshell, as to what it means to be a specialist, to be sort of one of the top people in your field. It's that people who consume your services are seeking you out. They have a big problem to solve, and they want to find the go-to person for it. So the idea is to try to become the best or nearly the best in a small market. You don't try to compete in a big market. It's the old adage that sometimes it's better to be a big fish in a small pond than a small fish in a big pond. So, of course, the corollary to someone seeking you out as the specialist is that you have to try to otherwise convince clients that they need you, and then you need to seek them out. And that's a much more difficult thing to do. There's a great book. I deal with this quite a bit in my book, but there's another great book on this topic that's called Small Giants. And it deals with small niche companies that are ultra profitable in different industries. There's a number of examples of this, but there's a good, easy to understand one about a leather pant maker who doesn't advertise, doesn't promote the business, but is ultra profitable and sells these leather pants for thousands of dollars. People like Sheryl Crow or Joe Perry of Aerosmith are customers. And so they dominate this market. It's a very niche, very small, but very profitable market. On the flip side, you know, someone could set out to make pants, make jeans, and try to compete with Levi Strauss, for example. And that's going to be much more difficult to do. So again, it's the difference between a generalist in a market that's trying to compete in a very broad, very diverse, very competitive area versus a specialist who picks a very narrow niche and tries to dominate it. And really the same principles apply in the legal marketplace. And there's very strong reasons and very important reasons to think specialized and think narrow. Lawyers simply can't try to be all things to all people and do things that many do, such as use some of these meaningless adjectives to describe and market themselves via, for example, their website bios. trustworthy, skilled, experienced, loyal. These mean little to clients. They're used by virtually all lawyers, and they become sort of these meaningless adjectives that don't give any flavor as to what you can actually accomplish or what value you provide to the marketplace that you're competing in. They need to offer them. Lawyers need to offer clients something meaningful in the form of specialized expertise, and they need to communicate it in a way that gets that value across. These traditional passive forms of communication, such as traditional advertising, simply aren't working. There's too much noise and static to break through in the marketplace these days to simply rely on those traditional forms of communication. And so today, when it comes to business development and positioning yourselves, those traditional attributes, quality work, technical proficiency, those are really table stakes when it comes to competing. You need to acquire the skills necessary to develop and sustain a client base over time, and that's a much different skill set. Clients today are looking for specialists. They're not looking for generalists to a great degree, and developing business requires that level of niche expertise. So I really think the path to success lies in specialization, and I'll be emphasizing that point throughout today's talk. Also keep in mind, however, that this is not a short, get rich quick scheme strategy. It takes time. This is the long game, and it takes a real strategic approach to what you're doing. And so we'll get into more detail about that in a moment. I thought I'd kind of begin to talk about the importance and the benefits of a niche practice I always think it's better to share a story or an example to make my point rather than just belaboring it without the benefit of that sort of objective example. So I want to speak about a gentleman by the name of Scott Becker, who is an accomplished attorney and an accomplished businessman. And he's someone who was generous enough to spend quite a bit of time speaking with me as I was writing my book, because I really think he represents a prototype of the type of lawyer who I'm describing here in terms of developing a niche practice and how to market it. So I'll tell you a little bit about Scott's story. Scott Becker is a Harvard law grad. He is the chairman of McGuire Woods Healthcare Practice. And early on in his career, probably as a mid-level, fourth, fifth, sixth year associate, he realized that in order to get in control of his life and his career, he needed to build a practice. And so he started where I think it wisely started at a good spot. He began by taking a look around him to see how other lawyers in his firm that he admired and respected and that were successful in their own right in terms of building a practice went about the process. And in doing so, he discovered certain commonalities among them and their approach, and he found a mentor who was willing to help, which again is another important point in terms of how to go about this process. So his mentor was also a healthcare lawyer, a senior lawyer in the firm. And the advice that he gave Scott was to carve a niche out for himself. And that made sense intuitively to Scott. He realized that having a niche would mean that he'd be working with clients with similar problems. And as a result, he'd be able to build up his expertise in that area, in that narrow niche that he was developing, and offer it to other clients or potential clients who are similarly situated. So he began by experimenting. One of the things Scott told me was that that was successful for him was there's never a perfect plan in terms of doing this. You need to experiment to figure out what works. And I think that makes perfect sense. And probably a lot of us have that's borne itself out as we've gone through various, phases of marketing our practices. So Scott realized though that as a young lawyer, achieving expert status, becoming known as like the go-to guy in a market, in an industry, and building a practice was the long game. It was not going to be easy. And so his advice was, you can't aim straight for the top. It's almost impossible to compete with big firms who are putting huge resources into protecting their biggest clients. But Scott said, there are lots of smaller clients in niche industries that you can pursue. And as you build up your practice and your expertise, then later in your career, you'll be in a position to go after the bigger clients. And again, I like this quote from Scott: you need to hit singles and doubles before you can hit home runs. And so what Scott did, with the support of his firm, he identified a few different potential niche areas within the healthcare segment that he believed were underserved but had potential for someone in his position with his level of expertise and experience at the time. And he began pursuing work. And the principle that he used to accomplish this was trying to get in the middle of the industries that you are focused on. So what he did, the tactical steps he took, was to create, and this is probably 20 years ago, before the internet, was a tool even in terms of marketing your practice. So he created these print newsletters geared towards each niche and began sending those out, and also hosting small industry conferences geared towards his potential industry niches. And he gained traction with one, which was surgical centers within the healthcare space, and he poured all of his energy into it. And he then, pretty soon he began to gain traction and build a practice. And the thing, when he started to become sort of the go-to guy within the surgical center niche, was that sort of built a foundation where once he sort of tackled that narrow niche, all of a sudden doors of opportunity opened with larger potential clients like healthcare systems and hospitals. So he built on his narrow niche, and through that process was able to develop a much broader practice and a much bigger book of business as a result. And coincidentally, and this is an aside, but it's an important one. Doing what we'll talk about later, which was Scott was one of the early practitioners of content marketing, a buzzword in legal marketing circle these days, through his newsletters. That in and of itself became a large profitable business for him. Today, it's one of Becker's Healthcare is his publishing, I hesitate to call it an empire, but it's one of the most widely read and respected publishing platforms in the healthcare sector out there. And it's all over the web. There's a bunch of different newsletters, and that's a large business in and of itself. And that all stemmed from his original newsletters that he started developing on his own, writing and sending out to clients. And so it's a pretty remarkable story in that sense. But I guess the one of the takeaways that Scott communicated was that in order to pick a niche and stick with it, you need to constantly be in front of your audience, providing personalized content. And Scott said most lawyers don't get results quickly enough so that they don't stick with it. And he says building a practice is a serious job, a full-time job, and you need to treat it as such. So the point is, get narrow, stick with it, provide content and thought leadership to your audiences, and it will help build a practice over time. So that's, I think, a great example of the strategy that we're going to be talking about further here, is Scott Becker. So let's get into the differences between someone who has a more general practice and someone who has a very specialized practice. And I think that is really the difference between someone who is a jack of all trades and a master craftsman. And a jack of all trades, if you visualize, and if you're viewing this continuum on the screen, you'll see that a jack of all trades is someone who's busy. A jack of all trades lawyer, for example, is someone who's busy, but often bouncing from project to project, learning a little about a lot. And one of the things about a jack of all trades is that clients think of the jack of all trades when price is a primary consideration. The jack of all trades is often reactive to opportunities. For example, a client may contact someone in this position and suggest that they need a family law lawyer. And because it's an opportunity, the jack of all trades, even though he has little experience in this area, decides to take it on. So he spends a great deal of time and effort getting up to speed on family law issues. He navigates his way through the nuances of the law and completes the engagement. Because he spent so much time, it's not particularly profitable. But then he sees a further opportunity. He says, I can now do family law. So he adds a practice area to his website, and he adds an element to his elevator pitch, and he now does family law as well as the other elements of his general practice. And then an estate planning matter comes in, and he takes that on, and the process repeats. And it's difficult to build a practice if that's what you're doing, because you're constantly shifting gears and you're never really getting that deep into any particular thing, and you're bouncing from thing to thing. So now the master craftsman, on the other hand, is also very busy but focused. She knows a lot about a little, of course, and as a result is able to charge a price premium. Referral sources think of the master craftsman when a particular type of expertise is needed. And so as a result, she's frequently on the short list, if not the only referral made, when lawyers are recommending someone to a potential client. And she doesn't need to get up to speed on the issues, because in most instances, because she's so deeply ingrained in her practice, answering questions and determining a plan of action is largely instinctual. And then importantly, she's also able to validate quickly whether a potential client is the right fit for her practice. And so this is critically important, and perhaps seems paradoxical to some, but the master craftsman turns away far more work than the jack of all trades. But the work she does take on aligns neatly with her experience, expertise, and interests. And so as a result of that, the master craftsman is oftentimes much more profitable than the jack of all trades lawyer. Because of her past experience, she can quickly determine and understand how much time a particular matter will take. And that allows her to become more creative in doing things like developing alternative fee arrangements or fixed fees for a particular engagement, which oftentimes leads to a more profitable engagement. Clients, I think, as we all know, they like set numbers. They like to be able to budget and understand what something's going to cost, even if that's a big number. What they don't like, even if it's a lesser number, are timesheets with a bunch of 0.1s and 0.2s on them. But if you don't know, if you're a jack of all trades who doesn't know how long something's going to take, you're left with little choice but to bill, on an hourly basis. And oftentimes that leads to one of two things: an upside surprise on a bill for a client, or cutting a bill deeply to avoid that upside surprise. And neither of which is a very attractive alternative. So at the end of the day, I think the master craftsman is where we want to be. Now, most lawyers, I think, fall somewhere in the middle of the continuum, and that's, they don't try to be all things to all people or all clients, but they do like to keep their options open, and that's understandable. But I think it's the wrong approach, and you can see it, for instance, if you look at many website bios, attorney website bios. Oftentimes people will list 10, 12, 15 different practice areas that they have experience in, and that's not the mark of a master craftsman. I guess this is driven by a few things, but one is the fear of missing out on opportunities. And that fear comes from what I think is a misguided notion that the more options you present the marketplace, the more opportunities will present themselves to you. And I just don't think that's the case. More options does not always equal more opportunities. It's also driven by a desire for variety. I think sometimes people fear like getting too narrow because they're going to do the same thing over and over. I also think that's misguided because in my experience, the more satisfying work is the deeper work, the work that's more interesting, is more challenging work, and the master craftsman is the one who that work gravitates towards, the one who can get through the the initial analysis of a problem quickly, knows the law, understands the issues, kind of has an instinct as to how a matter will play out, and then can really start thinking deeply about things like strategy and tactics and creative solutions to a problem. And that to me is where sort of that psychic satisfaction comes from, of intellectually challenging matters. And those are the types of matters that master craftsmen are often called to work on because they have the ability to get through the initial sort of minutia of a matter quickly and cut to the heart of it. There's a few examples of this, and I think good reading, if you want to think about this idea of limiting your opportunities. Many of you have probably heard of the book Essentialism by Greg McCune. If you haven't, I highly recommend you pick it up. It's all about saying yes to only the most critical and most important and most profitable and beneficial opportunities, and saying no to everything else. There's also a great article by a kind of a quirky but very smart guy by the name of Derek Sivers. His philosophy when it comes to making any decisions, really, but I think it's relevant to attorneys in terms of how they're filtering opportunities through their practice. Is his principle is it's not a yes or a no, it's a hell yes or no. So it's got to be a great opportunity, and if it doesn't align with your objectives, then it's a no. So that's kind of those are kind of some of the ideas that lawyers with and kind of some of the principles that lawyers with very specialized niche practices think about. Saying no more often than saying yes, knowing a lot about a little, and staying very focused in your practice. And so the next slide and the next topic is, okay, you might be saying, I kind of get the idea, and I kind of, I see the value in niching, but how do I go about the process? Like, what's the right area of specialty for me? And that's a very individual question, obviously. And kind of in looking at this, I think that for most people, potential areas of expertise to pursue can be identified at the intersection of your interests, your experience, and your and the market opportunities that are out there. So you can start by asking yourself 3 questions. The first is, what type of... The first is...
Some other places, there's like referrals. They're going to be like the big
really?
people referral place now.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're saying it's a new thing.
The first is, what type of work do I like to do? The second is, what type of work am I good at? And then the third, what opportunities exist in the marketplace? So in other words, you can't pick a niche that obviously, you don't want to have to try to create a market. You need to have at least some understanding that people are buying what you'd like to sell. So if you can determine those 3 things and find some commonality among them, you'll be in pretty good shape when it comes to carving out a niche. And I know this sort of sounds simplistic, and it is in many ways, but what I've found is that despite being simplistic, many lawyers don't think this way. And in thinking about that, I think it comes from, in many ways, the way in which lawyers are trained, and they kind of come up in law firms or whatever whatever format they're practicing in or environment they're practicing in. If from early on in most lawyers' careers, their days, and then as a result, their weeks, their months, and their years are dictated by inputs, right? They receive assignments from partners. They're reactive to emails and phone calls that they receive. And as a result, they never really take the time or learn the skill of prioritizing how they want to spend their day. They never really try to answer these three questions. And so as a result, they have a difficult time or never do kind of carve out a niche for themselves and act strategically. A good example of this is a former colleague of mine who fairly early in his career, he established himself. He was a very smart guy. He was a skilled corporate bankruptcy lawyer. Now that's, of course, what he's good at in this Venn diagram. But that's still a broad kind of big pond area of the law. And while he had knowledge and experience in U.S. bankruptcy law, he always had an interest in different aspects of international law, and that's what really interested him. So his experience was bankruptcy. His interest was international law. And those two things don't necessarily go together. But what he found was that there were opportunities to develop expertise in a narrow but important area of the law, and that was how the U.S. bankruptcy code and the UK pension law intersect and impact each other. So he was able to hone his expertise in this area in the early to mid 2000s, and then when 2008 rolled around and the bankruptcy financial crisis struck and the bankruptcy wave hit, he was well positioned for a number of large niche opportunities and engagements in U.S. bankruptcy cases that involved these international issues. So I think that's a good example of someone who kind of did this analysis and set himself up for those opportunities down the road by kind of doing this three-part analysis. And so I suggest and I urge you to do that as well. Another example of this, and then here's I know I mentioned before that sometimes you have to find an existing market opportunity. There's another good example of this that's a little bit different, and it might give you an opportunity to think about things a little bit differently. But there's a firm and two lawyers out in San Francisco. It's a small firm. It's called O'Reilly and Roach. And they're two relatively young lawyers who set off on their own, and they began doing consumer finance litigation. And they had a good practice, profitable, had clients, getting a lot of referrals from bigger firms. But they kind of stumbled upon this practice area, and this is kind of the point. It wasn't actually a practice area at the time. They stumbled upon this service that certain lawyers needed, which was lawyers. Their clients were lawyers, and lawyers who were departing large law firms as partners. And when you depart a large law firm as a partner, that various legal issues arise. You have to deal with your partnership agreement. There's various ethical issues that have to be dealt with, and it as many of you probably know, it can be a messy situation. So they started doing some of this work, counseling other lawyers on how to properly transition from a firm, and also counseling firms on how to deal with departing lawyers. And so the point being, they developed this expertise, and then they built their whole firm around what is kind of an area of law that didn't really exist. So when it comes to thinking about a niche for yourself, I guess the point I'm trying to make is you don't have to think within the existing box of what's out there. You don't have to say, oh, I just want to be a litigator, or I want to be a corporate lawyer, or I want to be a tax lawyer, and I want to carve a niche out in that area. Dan O'Reilly and Dina Roach were very entrepreneurial, and they actually kind of created a practice area and built an entire firm's practice around that kind of newly defined practice area for themselves. So they conducted the same analysis, but they had to go one extra step, was to kind of create a practice area and brand it as such, and as a result have created a profitable niche for themselves in that area. So that's a relatively quick spin through the process of picking a niche and the importance of niching, and I want to be conscious of time. So I want to go to the next element of what I want to talk about today, which is sure, you've got a niche and you've decided to pursue it, but who cares, right? No one knows about that until you're able to still market yourselves. So you still need to get yourself out there. And what I am suggesting is that one of the things that you should be doing as an expert is writing. Experts write, and that is really important because one of the nice things about positioning yourself as an expert in a narrow field is that selling, the traditional form of selling that no one really likes to do, is not required. Because your audience is smaller, narrower, it can be targeted via content marketing and thought leadership much more effectively. It's how Scott Becker, for example, built his practice. And not only does writing help you promote yourself as an expert, it helps you become one. It requires you to think deeply about the topics that are of interest to you and pertinence to you, to your clients. So the methodology, one methodology certainly, and tactic to promote yourself as an expert is to put your thoughts out in the marketplace and position yourself as a thought leader. And here's how it works. I say writing is selling because we all have an orbit of people and companies and organizations who sort of encircle us, who orbit us, and content acts as gravity to that orbit of people and contacts. It keeps people in your orbit, and as a result, those who are aware of you stay aware of you as a result of the content that you're putting out into the marketplace. And those not in your orbit move into it after becoming aware of you as a result of your content. And so when someone who's in your orbit has a problem or an opportunity in an area that you have written on, you'll be high on the person's list and top of mind as someone who possesses the requisite expertise or the knowledge to help them overcome the problem they're facing or the opportunity that they're presented with. And so while they may not act immediately, the continued thought leadership and writing that you're putting out in the marketplace will help keep you top of mind. And ultimately, the objective is to shift that relationship from reader-writer to client-attorney. Now, in order to do this, though, here's the big thing. You can't just mail it in. A few years ago, perhaps, just simply putting content out there, writing an article for a trade publication or doing a blog was enough. That was like cachet for, to get you noticed in the marketplace. Today, much more. Content is everywhere. The marketplace is cluttered with it. It's very difficult to break through. So you need to provide, and what experts do, those who are perceived as experts, is to provide deep insights, education, substance, thoughtfulness. In other words, wisdom. This is how you build an audience out in the marketplace using your writing and your content. So because if you really expect someone to give you their attention, you first need to give them your wisdom. And a big part of imparting wisdom and what experts do is they blaze new ground. They don't just simply, for example, let's use a common example. A new case is decided in the Supreme Court, and what often happens is firms rush to get the, summary of the case out on their blogs and in their email newsletters, and it's kind of a summary. It's somewhat surface level, and it doesn't really add anything to the conversation because everyone's doing the same thing. Blazing new ground would be taking a totally different tack and not just talking about what happened, but really talking about the implications of what happened as it relates to the specific industry in which you focus. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about blazing new ground. with your content. I mean, the ultimate form of content marketing and blazing new ground and imparting wisdom is writing the book on a topic. Many lawyers have used authoring a book as the ultimate calling card when it comes to developing new business. I won't go into it because I'm running a little short on time, but one of the people I profile in my book is John Trinacosta, who's a partner at Foley and Lardner in Detroit, and he wrote the book on the interaction of an interplay between the Uniform Commercial Code and automotive supply contracts and terms and conditions at the nascent stages of the when the tiered supply chain, automotive supply chain was developing. And he did that as a relatively young lawyer. And John is, as a result, for years has been considered one of the real go-to guys in that industry when it comes to UCC related litigation, the automotive industry. And he told me, he explained it, and I explained in my book that was, writing that book on those issues was, the springboard to his career, and still is the most important marketing element that he has. A few thoughts on tactical tactics when it comes to executing a content marketing strategy. Try to tell a story. It's always more relatable. It always sinks in, and it's more memorable. It's a more journalistic approach to your content and your writing. So it's important to tell a story. I get hit content home runs. What this means is, again, the way that people consume content these days and look for expertise online has changed to a great degree. Very rarely do people simply follow a blog anymore for their content. They seek out the best content regardless of its source. And so they go to aggregator sites like JD Supra, or they go on social media and look at what their friends on LinkedIn are recommending, or they go on Google and have Google do that sort of due diligence on what's valuable content for them. So content home runs, what I mean by that is if you go deep, long form content, very insightful, you impart wisdom, that's the type of content that can be found, and that can serve as a way to draw people into your blog, into your website, and have them explore things deeper. But you need that. If you're just doing surface level type content, no one's ever going to find it. Occasionally you need to go deep and produce something very meaningful in order for it to be sort of the entryway to the rest of your bio and your website. And that, as it relates to that, evergreen content, that goes hand in hand with content home runs, I think. Evergreen content is content that's timeless. It's oftentimes long form. It's the type of content that gets found over time. So I guess the point I'm trying to emphasize with this is, there's a tendency, I think, these days, and it's driven by some of the, these sites like BuzzFeed, and there's this tendency to go, quick and try to go viral with your content and be, these top 10 lists and 5 best ways to do this and that. That's fine and all, but it's very difficult to compete in that. And those who write that type of content, I don't think are oftentimes considered experts in their field. So this type of timeless, deep thinking, evergreen content is very important if you expect to be considered a expert in your field in the marketplace of ideas. And then finally, what to write about. This is very similar to kind of the analysis we did earlier with how to pick a niche. But we oftentimes think we know what our clients want to read about, but we're sort of guessing. We never truly know. So I think the best place to be focusing on when it comes to your writing is the intersection of your expertise and your clients' interests. And unless you ask your clients kind of what the issues, with your constant communication with them and asking them what issues are affecting them, then you'll never really know. So I suggest that, in the midst of your, various feedback sessions with your clients and potential clients, one of the things you ask them is, what issues are impacting you? If I was to write an article on something, what would you what would you like to read about? Oftentimes those questions are not asked, but I think they should be. And it's the best place to start when it comes to developing a content marketing strategy around a narrow field of expertise. So I know that was a quick spin through a very broad topic, and there's much more to learn on it, but what I really wanted to get across was think strategically, think entrepreneurially, pick a narrow area of specialization, stick with it, and then promote yourself as a thought leader via the content you produce and publish in the marketplace of ideas. And if you stick with that approach, like Scott Becker, like some of the other folks I spoke about, I think it will pay dividends over time. But it is the long game, but it can be a profitable and interesting one to pursue. So that's kind of a wrap up of my presentation. I know we're right about 45 minutes from where we started, so I'll wrap it up there and happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Perfect timing, Jay. Thank you. That was great. So we haven't had any questions coming through the chat yet, but let me just tell everybody, now is the opportunity to get those questions in. So type them into chat, and if we see any come up, I'll ask them of Jay. We have about 10 minutes left here, so I'll allow for a few minutes for folks to type in questions. And if I don't get any, we're going to come back to Jay, let him plug his book one more time, and then if he's willing, he can give folks contact info if folks are shy to ask questions on the webinar. But I'm going to pause for a little bit and see if we got any questions coming in. All right, got a question. So Jay, from Matt, we have a question. What are your suggestions for how to ask clients what they're interested in? What are some options that attorneys could use for that?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Matt.
Oh, sorry. Specifically, where options are being typed in. So how do you feel specifically about phone calls, in-person meetings, individualized emails?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. And I thought I was going to answer it, I think, the way you're asking it, Matt, which is sort of like tactically, how do you go about it?
Yeah.
And I always think the best way is in person. I mean, you know, I think that is, you know, an in-person conversation. And in doing that, right, I mean, what does everyone suggest when it comes to sort of connecting and being, you know, thoughtful when it comes to client meetings? It's being a really great listener, right? Asking open-ended questions and then listening to your clients. And sometimes you don't even need to ask the specific question. The conversation itself of like, what's impacting you guys these days? What's keeping you up at night? That will give rise to you know, lots of great ideas and content when it comes to you know, your writing. But yeah, I think absolutely an in-person you know, lunch meeting where you simply say, hey, look, we want to provide some more value in the form of, you know, the content we're producing. We're producing this content in the form of a newsletter or a blog, but we want to make sure that it's resonating and it's answering the questions and it's addressing the needs that you have. We're, you know, you being the client, we're doing this for you. We want to make sure that it's actually it's something that's useful. And I think clients will appreciate that. It's like a value add that makes them think, hey, I'm getting, you know, essentially getting free legal advice in the form of your content. And you're actually addressing the things that we care about. So I think having that conversation accomplishes two things. It gives you ideas for writing, and it also helps to, you know, cement you as like someone who's adding value beyond the billable hour to the client relationship. So
Jay, if you would be willing, so in person is your favorite option. How about these other options? Do you want to rank them and talk about them?
Yeah.
Phone calls, individualized emails, polls on SurveyMonkey or Twitter, e-newsletter. What do you think of those options?
You know what? You could pretty much rank them in that order. I'd say phone calls number 2. I'd say email number 3. Yeah. Although I'm gonna actually. I might amend that now that I think about it, because you know sometimes it depends, right? Too, you have to. Not every client is the same. Some clients hate getting a phone call out of the blue. Some clients prefer getting an email, and vice versa. So you have to know your client. some clients are more sort of introspective and like to think it through, and it might be more appropriate to send them an email and let them answer, more thoughtfully at their own pace and type out a more detailed response. So I'd say, kind of know your client, but I think the more personal you can get with the request, the better. We've done, we've tried to do work with clients to get those, let's cover, 500 of our clients and do a survey and try to get feedback. And you get 3 responses. So that sort of automated survey type stuff, I don't think that works particularly well. I think the in-person touch, and the beauty of that is if you are immersed in a niche, in a narrow niche, that would mean that most of your clients are, again, similarly situated and facing similar problems. And so you don't need to survey every client. Ostensibly you only need to talk to one because they're competitors, and your other clients in that area are all facing the same issues. So.
Thanks, Jay.
Sure.
So I'm going to pause for a couple more minutes, see if anybody has any more questions. We got 5 minutes left here, but if no questions come in, we're going to wrap up a little early. Thanks, Matt, for your question. All right, that seems like all the action we get today, Jay. See you out, everybody. They have no questions. Oh, wait a second. I spoke too soon. All right, here's another question for you. So, Jay, this is a question from Lucas. Do you see a difference between writing for a referral audience versus for clients directly, potential clients?
In a sense, right? So here's would be 2 examples I would see of that. So let's say you are, but not much. I mean, pretty similar. A referral audience. Let's say you're getting referrals from other attorneys, for example. You have let's say you represent manufacturers reps, and you've got this narrow little niche, and a lot of other lawyers may not know the law in that area, so your main source of business might be referrals from them. So you might write an article for the Bar Journal in your state, because that's obviously going to other lawyers, and you want to become more well known among other lawyers. You might draft it. You might draft something a little bit differently, but not that much differently, because I think the ultimate objective of any writing you're doing is trying to demonstrate expertise. And so whether you're writing it for an audience of lawyers or you're writing it for an audience of potential clients, you're going to be speaking, and you're going to be dealing with the topics in a very similar fashion. And I think the one trap I would say, I wouldn't, the danger of thinking about different audiences, like referral audiences versus the direct client. Again, to use if your referral sources are other lawyers example, I think if we were writing for other lawyers, it might seem like there's a tendency or a benefit to writing in a more sophisticated fashion, or more legalese, or sort of jargon and Latin, that kind of stuff that you see, lawyers sometimes use when they're drafting briefs or writing law review articles. Strip all of that stuff out of. I don't care who your audience is. Try to keep it as sophisticated as possible, but as simple as possible at the same time. Those aren't, I don't think those are mutually exclusive things. You want to, I think, communicate in much the same fashion, regardless of who your audience is. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying maybe a little bit differently, thinking about, your audience, but not much. Really what you're trying to do in any piece is communicate your expertise in a very clear fashion.
Thanks, Jay. All right, I think we're going to put a bow on this bad boy at this point. I don't see any more questions coming in. People are starting to log off. So, Jay, let me ask you one more time. Can you tell people about your book?
Sure.
And if they have questions that they want to ask post the program, how can they contact you?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thanks again, everyone, for spending a little time here. My book, One of a Kind, it's being sold by Attorney at Work, attorneyatwork.com. you can go on their site and you'll find it. You can also go to oneofakindlawyer.com and you'll be able to find a link to it, learn more about it there as well. And that's also a link to my website. My website is hcommunications.biz.biz. And if anyone has questions and would like to learn more about anything or follow up, I'm happy to respond via email or have a phone call. Always happy to talk about these topics. My email is jay@hcommunications.biz. So happy to, you can reach me in many different fashions. Twitter, I respond that way. Email, you'll find my phone number on my website. And happy to chat about any and all topics legal marketing related.
Thank you, Jay. You're out there doing God's work.
Thank you.
So this will wrap up another edition of your Lunch Hour Legal Marketing webinar and podcast series. Thanks for attending, and we'll see you all next month.